My name is Sarah Heckler, and I work as an advisor for human rights and labour standards with the UN Global Compact Network Germany. We will give everybody a few more seconds to join the call, but first, let's get some logistical questions out of the way. We will be recording today's webinar, and you will receive the slides later today. Please feel free to share any questions you have via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You also have the option to share questions anonymously if you prefer to do that. Please upvote any questions that interest you particularly by leaving a thumbs up. That really helps us prioritize your most urgent questions. If you decide to leave the webinar at any point, a short feedback questionnaire will pop up. We really appreciate if you take the time to share your feedback, especially some tips on any topics we should cover in the future. But now to kick things off, I'm really happy that today I'm not doing the webinar by myself, but I'm joined by my excellent colleague, Michaela Streibel. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks for the warm introduction and welcome. My name is Michaela Streibel and I work as an advisor with the German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights, and I'm a lawyer by training.
Great. Before we take a look at what we want to cover during the next hour, we wanted to take a moment to share who we are for all of you who are joining us for the first time today. The UN Global Compact is the world's largest initiative for corporate sustainability and responsibility worldwide, with more than 26,000 members. Since being founded in 2000 by then UN General Secretary Kofi Annan, the UN Global Compact has been supporting companies in acting responsibly in accordance with the 10 principles on human rights, labor standards, the environment, climate, and anti-corruption, and contributing solutions to the Sustainable Development Goals. I work for the local German network, but there's a variety of local networks all over worldwide working on these topics. Now, Michaela works for a different organization and is joining us today to represent the Help Desk.
So yeah, the German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights is a German government support service for businesses and business associations. And you can see it on the slide. We offer initial consultation, referral advice, and awareness raising, all in the field of business and human rights. And our services range from advisory services over participating in events to different online tools. And yeah, our main focus of our work at the moment for the last years has been the German Supply Chain Act.
Sadly, we don't have the time to get to know all of you as well. So let's dive into today's webinar's topic. You're joining us until 11:30, and we're planning to break down the key points and elements of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act over the next hour. Building on that short introduction to the Act, Michaela will take a closer look at contract design and procurement practices. I will then share why and how you can start your human rights due diligence journey under the Supply Chain Act. Finally, after some tips for further reading, we look forward to answering any questions you might have. So again, please feel free to share your questions via the Q&A function. And with that, I will hand over to Michaela for a first look at the German Supply Chain Act.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, I'm not going to explain everything that's happening on this slide. There's a lot going on. Just very quickly, the German Supply Chain Act, it has not been created in a political or legal vacuum, but builds on already existing international standards, most importantly, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the OECD guidelines and guidance. You can see the UNGP on the bottom left of the slide. And then the first German government's attempt to implement the UNGP was the German National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Monitoring showed that less than 20% of the companies participating in the monitoring are actually observing due diligence processes based on the German National Action Plan, and that then triggered a provision in the coalition contract of the government at the time, and then this initiated the legislative procedure around the German Supply Chain Act. There are also developments on the EU level. We will not be going into this today, but the German Supply Chain Act will be amended because of the CSDDD, and then obviously because, depending on the final CSDDD after the omnibus process. Looking at the, looking at the next slide on the key points of the German Supply Chain Act. So who is in scope? It's German companies, big German companies. We started 2023 with companies that have at least 3,000 employees in Germany. And then 2024, the threshold was lowered to companies that have at least 1,000 employees in Germany. The Act prescribes due diligence obligations in the so-called supply chain, so in the own operations and towards direct suppliers, as well as towards indirect suppliers. In this case, however, obligations only exist if there is so-called substantiated knowledge, so when actual indications exist that suggest a violation. What's important to note, and this also stems already from the nature of the obligations as due diligence obligations, the obligations are duties of effort, and there's no obligation to guarantee that supply chains are free of risks or violations. And companies have to implement these due diligence obligations by implementing a so-called risk management system. And you can see it on the slide. We like to divide up the risk management system into different elements that group together individual obligations. So first, there's strategy and implementation. So companies need to have a strategy in relation to business and human rights and must assign responsibilities and roles. Then they must conduct a risk analysis to identify risks and violations, then react to these risks and violations with preventive and remedial measures. They also have to implement a complaints procedure with which affected persons, but also third parties can notify the company of problems. They must do effectiveness assessment and then reporting. We'll look into the reporting a little bit later. The material scope of the obligations is certain human rights and environmental obligations that are listed in the Act. The Act does not affect or does not change already existing legal basis of civil liability. It has an effect on the existing liability rules, but it does not create its own liability rules. And it even clarifies this explicitly. And the laws implemented by means of public enforcement for this purpose, an already existing authority, the Federal Office for Economics and Export Control, the BAFA, was assigned to implement the German Supply Chain Act and was equipped with different powers. And in order to enforce the act, they can issue as a last resort fines and the exclusion from public procurement procedures. Somehow, I'm really sorry, I have problems changing the slides, even though we have practiced this many times. Looking at documentation and reporting. In this context, the German Supply Chain Act is probably one of the only laws that creates a duplicate situation to the already existing reporting or now existing reporting obligations of the CSRD. And this is because the German Supply Chain Act actually is older than the CSRD. It was passed when we only had the NFRD, so the non-financial reporting directive. And at the time, it was not clear whether there would be the corporate sustainability reporting directive, but there will be amendments to the German Supply Chain Act to abolish this duplication at the moment and to allow companies to choose whether they comply with their reporting under the Supply Chain Act with the questionnaire that the BAFA is issuing, or whether they want to use the CSRD report that they're doing anyways. And so they must report annually, transmit this electronically, and keep internal records for at least 7 years. So I mentioned that companies with at least, at the moment, 1,000 employees in Germany are in scope of the Supply Chain Act, but the Act has effects beyond this group of companies. And that is because the Act requires companies to implement these due diligence obligations in their supply chains and change living and working conditions to the better in global supply chains. And this obviously is not possible without also engaging with different actors in the supply chain. And this also means that they need to engage with their suppliers if they want to create change at the level of their different suppliers. And you can see it on the slide, they might need information from their suppliers for the purpose, for example, of their risk analysis. They will need some level of cooperation of their suppliers for preventive and remedial measures, and they might also need assistance when they want to implement the complaints procedure, in particular when it comes to making it accessible to, for example, staff, workers of the supplier, or communities in the vicinity of their supplier. It might be quite difficult to imagine that they will, put up a poster in relation to the accessibility of the grievance mechanism at the supplier site without at least their okay. But it's important to note that the Act does not create any legal obligations for these companies. So smaller companies in Germany, or smaller but also bigger companies outside of Germany, have no legal obligations whatsoever in relation to the German Supply Chain Act. So they are not obliged to collaborate with their obliged customers. They don't have any reporting obligations. They don't fear risks of being sanctioned by the competent authority. And what's also really important to note, and I explain this a little bit more in detail because this is really key, a mere transfer of obligations is not permitted under the German Supply Chain Act. So actually the Act, even though sometimes it is implemented by risk-shifting practices, it does not allow risk-shifting practices. So I'll now mention a couple of fundamental principles of the German Supply Chain Act. And the first principle I want to touch upon is the change of perspective. And that is probably the success story of the UNGP, is that they used an instrument, a procedure that companies were already using in practice, and applied this principle on business and human rights, on environmental and human rights topics. And companies have already been implementing, have been using risk management for a long time to manage what we call classical risk, to manage company risks. So they would be doing classic risk management and be using an outside-in perspective. So look at what are the risks that are created outside of my company that have an impact on my company, on my operations, on my liquidity, on the market I'm operating in, on my reputation, and so on. And now the UNGP and the Supply Chain Act that builds on them is using the same procedure, but forces companies to change the perspective from the outside-in perspective to an inside-out perspective. And instead of looking at what are the risks that are outside of me and coming towards me that I need to manage, what are the risks actually that I am creating by my activities on what's around me, so on people and the environment. And so this is something that companies know very well, how to do risk management, and using this tool that they have at their hands and they're familiar with for this new topic, I believe is a great idea, and probably why this has been adopted so successfully by so many companies. And when we're changing this perspective, we're looking at in particular vulnerable groups and the classic human rights topics that are governed by the Act, like child labor, forced labor, adequate pay, workers' rights, and so on. And in order to change perspective, companies need to consider the interests of the potentially affected persons. So the interests of potentially affected persons are actually in the center of the due diligence process of the German Supply Chain Act, and this is why we also put them in the center in this graphic of the risk management system. So the risk management system really revolves around the interests of the affected persons, and the German Supply Chain Act is often misunderstood to not require stakeholder engagement, but it actually does. And the language it uses for this purpose is that is the appropriate consideration of the interests of the affected person. And in this context, the Supply Chain Act requires engagement with employees as well as otherwise affected persons. So employees is a broad definition in this context, which also includes, for example, freelancers, or people who are statistically, or according to labor or social law, not included in employment statistics, or people without work permit. And otherwise affected persons are people who are directly or might be directly affected by impacts of the economic activities in the supply chain. So these would be typically residents of communities near production facilities, for example, or of suppliers or of own operations. And companies need to engage with them in relation to all the elements of the risk management system. And they can do that through direct consultation or also consultation of legitimate representatives. I'll next touch upon two other fundamental principles of the Supply Chain Act, and these are effectiveness and appropriateness. And the German Supply Chain Act requires companies to implement effective and appropriate due diligence, and also implement an effective and appropriate risk management system, and accordingly also implement an effective and appropriate risk analysis, effective and appropriate measures, effective and appropriate grievance mechanism, and so on. And in this context, it's really important to understand what does effectiveness mean, and also what does appropriateness mean, because it sets the threshold of when companies are complying with the law. And this is relevant both when they are implementing measures in their own operations and when they're implementing measures in the supply chain. And from the principles of effectiveness and appropriateness, and we'll go into this a little bit more in detail, we can also derive boundaries of what companies are allowed to do when trying to comply with the Act in relation to their supply chains, in relation to risk analysis, in relation to contract design, in relation to purchasing and procurement practices. And effectiveness basically means that what companies are doing can reach the goal of these due diligence obligations. So we have an obligations of means, so not an obligations of guarantee. So companies don't have to reach the goal of no risks, no violations, but they are not allowed to do something that from the start doesn't even at least promise this. So they're not allowed to do something that doesn't make it more likely that we are achieving this goal. And so when we're looking at effectiveness and appropriateness, effectiveness basically shows like into which direction companies have to run, which out of several possible things, possible tools they can implement. And then appropriateness defines out of different different paths they could choose, these different tools they could be implementing, how much effort do they need to put into this, or when maybe several different tools or several different paths might be possible. Appropriateness might also restrict this selection. And appropriateness is a little bit more complicated than effectiveness, because it's you find it on the slide, it's a set of different criteria. The law doesn't define in which relationship they stand to each other, and the law does also not spell out which criteria are relevant in relation to which due diligence obligation. But interpreting it also based on the UNGP and OECD guidance and guidelines, as well as on the purpose of the provision, becomes quite clear that they do play different roles in relation to different due diligence obligations. It's probably would go a bit too much into detail to spell it out completely, but maybe in a nutshell, so nature and extent of companies' activities, that means on the one hand, how many resources does a company have? So the more resources they have, the more resources they can be expected to also use for the due diligence obligations, but also what's the nature of their activities? That means how risk prone are their activities? A company that's more risk prone is also expected to invest more versus a company that has the same amount of resources but has less risky activities, or is operating in less risky markets, and so on. And this applies to all of the due diligence obligations. So the more risky, the more resource, the more they have to do. Then the ability to influence the party directly responsible is particularly relevant when looking at what type of measure they could be implementing, because depending on the influence, you can do very different things. Then severity, reversibility, and probability of occurrence of a violation. This also, in relation to the risk analysis, triggers obligations to use more resources in the risk analysis in relation to measures. means that they have to invest more in relation to measures, as well as in relation to the grievance mechanism. The people that need to be put into the focus of making it accessible, for example, are people that are more likely to be affected more severely from the company's activities and activities of suppliers in the supply chain. And the nature of the causal contribution to a risk or to a violation is mostly understood as a limitation to what can be expected of companies when it comes in particular to measures. So a company that has only contributed very little to a problem is only expected to provide to the solution of the problem, corresponding proportional to how much they have contributed. Yeah, coming to, I've mentioned that we'll look into collaboration and risk analysis, and also procurement practices and contract design. So when looking at appropriateness and effectiveness, there's lots we can understand already that limits what companies can demand from their supplier. I've already mentioned that there's no obligation to collaborate, and risk shifting is not permitted. And very often we see that companies are really overloading their suppliers with requests in relation to comply with their own obligation to do a risk analysis. Very often they are requesting information that might not be necessary because it's really without relevance in the context. Maybe they're asking for sensitive information, or maybe they're even asking for contractual assurance from the supplier that everything is perfect. And then they're not allowed to use this and say, okay, I don't have to analyze this actor in the context of my risk analysis. Generally speaking, the burden should be covered by the company that is obliged, and companies should also try to implement risk analysis measures that reduce burdens for supplier, in particular administrative burdens. So they're well advised in, for example, joining together with other obliged companies, for example, in the industry, to create a shared questionnaire to approach suppliers, cover for costs for audits, and also cover for costs of filling in self-declarations and questionnaires. And when talking about contractual assurances already play a huge role in practice. They've already played a big role in practice before the German Supply Chain Act, and the relevance is likely going to grow. Contracts and contractual assurances or code of conducts are an important piece of the puzzle of due diligence, but they're not the whole puzzle. And when looking at other instruments, they're not the most effective tool. So it is very important to look at proper contract design, but also make sure that it's not the only tool that companies are using, because alone, without combining it with other instruments, it's not the most effective measure, because it's merely a tool to communicate expectations and make them legally enforceable. I mentioned many times now that a mere transfer of obligations is not permitted. Companies shall instead collaborate in light of a shared responsibility, which also means that legitimate interests and capacity of suppliers are considered. And what's really important as well is that the German Supply Chain Act implements the principle enabling before withdrawal. So that means that the termination of contracts is only ever a last resort under special requirements, after having tried to address a violation when there's no prospect of success. And this is so fundamental because poor contract designs, in particular risk shifting provisions, combined with too far-reaching termination rights, create negative incentives, because suppliers might be deterred from sharing what's going on, what problems and challenges they're facing, out of fear of losing an important customer. So instead of creating more transparency, these types of contracts actually reduce transparency. And procurement practices, purchasing practices are also a very fundamental, a very important tool in the context of the German Supply Chain Act. It's underlined both in the Act as well as in the explanatory memorandum of the German government to this German Supply Chain Act. And purchasing practices, procurement practices, also as well as contractual practices, must meet the threshold of effective and appropriate. And when looking at what companies can do in practice, they should look at their prices. So prices must cover all direct and indirect labor costs, including costs for sustainability and living wages and incomes. They must also look at their lead times, look at short-term versus long-term changes and short-term versus long-term contractual terms. So building on more long-lasting, stable contractual relationships, more plannable orders, allows for suppliers to also perform better in relation to human rights and the environment, and generally more long-term contractual relationships should also be offered as an incentive for good sustainability performance. So, and with that, I'm coming to the end to a short presentation of the German Supply Chain Act, and I hand back over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michaela, for that short introduction. I now want to turn to a more practical side of implementing the LkSG. So to start off, I want to briefly delve into the business case for both regulatory compliance and human rights due diligence in general. Regulation can often feel like a bureaucratic burden for companies, but both human rights due diligence and the level playing field created by regulation can also offer great benefits. To make that case, I'll break it down into two categories: risks and opportunities. I should briefly emphasize that the points summarized here are not exhaustive, but merely a summary of some of the most important arguments. The first category we'll explore is risks. Failing to address human rights regulatory compliance properly can result in serious consequences for your business. And here's some key risks to consider. As governments around the world introduce more stringent regulations on human rights and environmental practices, non-compliance can expose your company to significant legal and financial consequences. As Michaela highlighted, the LkSG includes such provisions on sanctions for non-compliance or violations. In addition to having to pay a fine, a violation of the LkSG also poses the risk of reputational harm. Publicly submitted complaints are often picked up in reports by the press, and such negative publicity is then again registered by ESG ratings and tools. All of this can erode customer trust and may adversely affect your brand. Reputational harm or a lack to engage with human rights due diligence can also affect your relationship with investors, as they increasingly prioritize sustainability and human rights as key criteria when evaluating potential investments. Companies that fail to implement robust human rights due diligence and do not ensure regulatory compliance risk losing access to funding or face lower valuations from investors who prefer businesses with strong ESG practices. Another group of people who are getting more involved in this topic is customers. Customers, be it regular consumers or other companies, for all of you who are working B2B, are also increasingly socially conscious. More and more businesses are looking for suppliers and partners that align with their values and are compliant with relevant regulation. Many have even begun incorporating ESG performances into their contracting, as Michaela was just outlining. Consequently, businesses that fail to comply with human rights standards may find themselves losing customers, key partners, and business opportunities. Lastly, human rights issues, whether in your company or along your supply chain, can disrupt operations in unexpected ways. This can include strikes, protests, workers' unrest, or delays due to regulatory investigations. These disruptions can impact your production timelines, increase costs, and damage relationships with suppliers and customers. This concludes my short summary of some of the most relevant risks and the scary sounding part. But taking action on human rights due diligence is not only associated with risk mitigation, but also presents a number of opportunities for companies that I find really, really important to look at as well. Let's start with a key opportunity that often gets overlooked: increased productivity. When businesses invest in human rights due diligence, they create healthier, safer, and more equitable work environments. Employees who feel respected and protected are more motivated and engaged in their work. They're less likely to experience workplace accidents or to be absent due to stress. A positive workplace culture that respects workers' rights fosters greater collaboration, creativity, and focus, all of which, in turn, leads to higher efficiency and overall productivity. So it is very much in your pure business interest to also look at human rights due diligence. Now, let's talk about competitive advantages and brand differentiation. As briefly mentioned, consumers and business partners are becoming more socially conscious. As a result, they're increasingly looking to align themselves with companies that also reflect their values. Taking a proactive stance can set you apart in a busy marketplace, creates customer loyalty, and can help you access new markets, giving you a distinct competitive edge. Next, let's discuss higher employee satisfaction and retention. Employees are more likely to stay with companies that prioritize their well-being and respect their rights. When employees feel valued, they're more likely to remain committed to your company. High employee retention that in turn reduces recruitment costs and ensures that you have skilled, experienced workers. Additionally, satisfied employees are often ambassadors for the company, helping to attract top and especially young talent. In direct contrast to the operational disruptions and delays I mentioned as a risk, a company that engages in human rights due diligence is often more likely to avoid potential disruptions caused by scandals, protests, or lawsuits. Human rights due diligence often means that companies start to work more closely with their suppliers and strengthen these relationships in the long term. Some companies reap the benefits of these investments during COVID when their supply chains proved more resilient and equipped to handle crises. Finally, let's talk about stakeholder relations. As companies become more transparent and proactive in human rights due diligence, they often build stronger relationships with key stakeholders, from investors to consumers to regulators, civil society, and the local communities in which they operate. Such a social license to operate can go a long way to ensure further opportunities. These include constructive engagement with criticism before it can develop into reputational harm, or, for example, less local opposition to a change in your production. In short, being transparent and committed to human rights strengthens the trust and collaboration with your stakeholders, leading to long-term success. Now that we've explored the risks and opportunities associated with human rights due diligence, it's clear that the benefits of effective human rights due diligence go beyond just compliance. They can have a profound impact on your company's success and long-term sustainability. However, navigating the complexities of human rights due diligence can seem daunting at first. Drawing from our work with companies of different sizes and across various industries, we've gained valuable insights into what works and what doesn't when it comes to implementing human rights due diligence effectively. In this next section, we'll share some of our key learnings and offer practical recommendations to help your business integrate human rights due diligence into your operations in a meaningful and impactful way. When you first start developing human rights due diligence processes, like I said, it may seem like a really daunting task. But most companies already have systems and measures in place that you can build on. Michaela mentioned this when she talked about risk analysis, that some of these seemingly new concepts are actually quite familiar. One important learning we want to share is that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. The first step of any human rights due diligence process should be to conduct a baseline assessment of what is already in place. This may range from compliance management systems to health and safety guidelines or a supplier code of conduct. Once you have identified existing processes, you can use them as a starting point. Always consider adapting or expanding what you already have, rather than adding or inventing new parallel processes that just create additional work. Apart from the fact that any human rights due diligence process should include you communicating your efforts, creating transparency is central to the kind of collaboration human rights due diligence requires, and that Michaela also mentioned. In order to actually identify risks in both your own operations and your supply chain, you will depend on people sharing both positives and negatives. That includes other departments flagging potential risks or affected persons reporting adverse impacts. Suppliers often feel that they can't really share human rights issues they encounter out of a fear that their buyers will suspend contracts. Yet failing to speak honestly about challenges will just leave them unaddressed. That is why it's essential to create trusting relationships and to ensure transparency on how you operate. We also highly recommend engaging with and supporting multi-stakeholder initiatives and cross-industry solutions. These ways of working with other companies and stakeholders like NGOs or unions have proven really effective in helping address 3 challenges that many companies initially struggle with, and that some of you might be familiar with. Many of you will be familiar with requests from buyers to fill out a questionnaire or submit data to a tool. These individual requests can eat up a lot of your time that you then can't invest into actually implementing projects. Industry and multi-stakeholder initiatives aim to create a common approach and, for example, streamline questionnaires, meaning that instead of completing 40 different ones, you can fill out one and share it with several buyers. In addition, developing scalable solutions together saves individual companies the time and the money that they would have to invest if they did it by themselves. Another issue many companies initially struggle with is a lack of leverage. One singular company can't change how a market or an industry operates. In addition, many human rights issues transcend borders, making it really hard to implement effective measures by yourself. Collaborating with companies and other stakeholders can increase your leverage and bargaining power vis-a-vis suppliers, regulators, and other key actors. By speaking with one voice and creating a shared standard that you can foster and enables you to develop the kind of holistic solution that actually has a positive impact. Lastly, most companies at some point of the human rights due diligence process face challenges or questions that they find difficult to answer. Maybe that led you here today. MSIs and industry initiatives often support knowledge sharing and foster engagement with diverse stakeholders like NGOs, governments, or unions. By engaging in these processes, companies can tap into expertise from a variety of sectors, the experience and learnings from peers, as well as specialized knowledge. Both your peers and other stakeholders can help you expand your knowledge of human rights due diligence and can help to identify blind spots that you might not even be aware of. Embedding respect for human rights requires assigning appropriate responsibilities for human rights within the company. Initially, a single function or department may need to take the lead in kickstarting the process. The LkSG requires companies to create the office of a Chief Human Rights Officer. These people are responsible for overseeing and verifying the implementation of the law within the company. This role may fall to one person or a group of people. Creating such a centralized position has proven helpful for many German companies as it creates a direct point of contact for the board and ensures ownership. At the same time, setting up human rights experts in other departments, like procurement, for example, or country offices is also essential. The department coordinating the human rights diligence effort will be able to communicate more easily with their points of contact and can collect the information they need. This coordination with other departments also extends into the kind of governance that can facilitate effective human rights due diligence. Company decisions that involve human rights often present difficult dilemmas. A growing number of companies have created a committee that addresses human rights-related dilemmas such as ethics, integrity, or corporate responsibility committee. Corporate functions like procurement, human resources, and sales will also need to be involved to ensure that there's cross-functional support for the embedding process and to pool practical knowledge. For many companies, meeting new legislative requirements involves a process of change management in which leadership from the top, including the board, is essential. Senior management has a really unique role to play in signaling the importance of human rights to the business. And in addition to human rights diligence, it can require trade-offs. For example, when you have to decide between cost effectiveness and sustainability. Having the backing of corporate leadership really equips the human rights teams with the kind of resources and decision-making power that they need to actually manage these dilemmas. Now, for my last point, I've named it Go Slow and Start Early. When it comes to developing human rights due diligence processes, it's essential to take your time. Rushing through this phase may seem tempting, but it's far more beneficial to take a step back and build a process that is thorough, well integrated, and sustainable in the long run. Developing robust human rights due diligence measures requires careful thought and attention to detail. By moving too quickly, you risk implementing solutions that are either incomplete or ineffective, which could expose your company to human rights violations or legal risks down the road. Instead, try to approach this development stage with the mindset of laying a strong foundation. Invest the time to understand the full scope of your supply chain, assess potential risks, engage with your stakeholders. This ensures that your human rights due diligence processes are comprehensive and deeply embedded in the way your business operates, making them more effective and adaptable to future challenges and future regulation. Another critical piece of advice is to begin your preparations early. Taking a proactive approach helps protect your company from potential legal complications and reputational damage. Early preparation means you will have the time to build and adjust your human rights due diligence process at a pace that works for you, rather than being caught in a time crunch as deadlines approach. This allows you to gradually build up to the requirements set out by human rights due diligence legislation like the LkSG, and ensuring that all of the necessary systems are in place. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are really a good starting point for this, as they provide a framework that serves as the foundation for most human rights due diligence regulations you'll encounter. Understanding and aligning your processes with the UNGPs will help ensure that your company is well positioned to not only comply with the LkSG, but also with other human rights due diligence legislation. We really hope that you'll use this webinar as a starting point to delve deeper into the LkSG and human rights due diligence in general. And to help you along the way, we've collected a list of additional resources that may prove helpful. The German federal government and the responsible supervisory authority, the BAFA, have published a number of helpful guidances on some key tenets of the law. I want to briefly hand over back to Michaela because you're way more qualified to present on what the help desk is doing than I am.
Yeah, thanks very much. Maybe moving to the next slide, you find an overview. Oops.
I think it's on this slide. Not to create any.
I'm very sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you find an overview of our services. So I've already mentioned that we provide for free of charge advisory services. We also do training programs, and this really ranges from helping companies design their own training programs by, for example, sharing our material with them, up to doing bespoke trainings on the side with the company staff that we've designed together with them. We also participate in events like today, but we also have our own event series, some online, some in person, also engaging with different actors from different spheres. So some bringing together people from the business sphere with political actors or civil society. We have a range of online tools. I believe these are hyperlinks, so I invite you to click on them to check them out. Behind them, there are some really, I believe, fantastic resources that help you implement or improve on your due diligence processes. Our SME Compass has two components. The first one, the due diligence compass, is a very hands-on, step-by-step guide that guides you through the different steps of implementing the due diligence system, as well as its individual elements. And the second component, the standards compass, helps you identify how to use and when to use standards in your due diligence process, but it also helps you identify the limitation of standards and allows you to compare certain standards with one another. And our tool, CSR Risk Checker, is actually not our tool, it's a tool by a Dutch organization, MVO Nederland. We provide for the German translation. It's also available in English and Dutch. Is a very great starting point for the risk analysis, in particular for the abstract risk analysis. You'll find a very easy search mask that allows you then to access information from around about 3,000 sources, from media, from NGO reports, from government reports, and also scientific reports and studies. And lastly, our tool, Business and Human Rights Navigator, is a tool that highlights 11 topics from the context of business and human rights, shows you how to address them in the different phases of the due diligence process. It's also a great glossary for other tools of other organizations and has lots of practical examples. And this also is a tool that we're doing together with UN Global Compact and Verisk Maplecroft.
Yeah, we really have the first question on the CSR risk check. I believe by now it's also available in French and Spanish. Again, we will share the slides immediately afterwards, and then you can take the time to kind of click through all of the slides. And that's also just another perfect reminder to share your questions in the chat. We've allocated some time. We already have some questions with a more regulation focus. Please also feel free to upvote again by giving a thumbs up to the questions you're most interested in. I just want to quickly dock on with the kind of information and resources that we offer as the UN Global Compact as well. So in addition to the webinar you've just joined, we have a whole host of other webinars also on other topics from our environment colleagues, for example. Generally speaking, I really recommend accessing the UN Global Compact Academy. It's a centralized platform where you can find a lot of learnings, courses, and also a navigator on EU regulations. So all of you in the F&A asking for more information on that. We have some really, really great colleagues in Brussels who are publishing webinars and resources on that. Another key resource I want to recommend, and I've actually already spotted some people attending this webinar who are currently in this training course, the UN Global Compact offers the annual Business and Human Rights Accelerator. It's a 6-month training program for our members that kind of gives you a crash course in all of the different key elements of human rights due diligence. We at the local German network also offer it free of charge because we think it's really important that every company has the ability to access this kind of learning. And then in general, just to kind of hint to check out the publications and events on human rights and labor standards on our website. I briefly want to point out that there's a lot of excellent partners out there that you can also access. So the German Chambers of Commerce abroad often offer different companies and helplines for German companies operating in other countries, but also the Business Scouts for Development and the Initiative for Global Solidarity have some great resources that you can look into. And I believe that brings us to the questions we have collected in the chat. So our 2 most popular questions, I think I'll field over to you, Michaela, as you are the lawyer of the 2 of us. First question is, does the stop the clock decision also stop obligations on LkSG submissions due this year?
Yeah, the simple answer is no. The German Supply Chain Act is not affected by any decisions made on the European level. And the stop the clock decision only stops the transposition deadlines for the CSDD and the entry into force of the CSRD for certain groups of companies.
And the second question we have here is, how does the Supply Chain Act relate to the EUDR?
Yeah, there is no, I mean, obviously, both of them deal with supply chains and they deal with certain topics where certain overlap, but there's no clear reference in one of the documents to the other. The EUDR as European law has priority over German domestic law. And also, generally, the EUDR would be the more special law, and special law always takes priority over the more general law. So where we have obligations of the EUDR, in this context, the EUDR applies, but oftentimes you'll have obligations existing in a parallel way. So just because that's in relation to one supplier, you have obligations under the EUDR because you're importing cocoa, you will still have Supply Chain Act obligations in relation to all the other topics, basically. And yeah, the EUDR and the Supply Chain Act also have a very different mechanism because the EUDR works with prohibitions of import, export, and use in the market, whereas so it's obligations of guarantee basically, whereas the Supply Chain Act has duties of effort. So this might be a little bit difficult of implementing it in practice. So it's really important to look at, even though you might need guarantees from your supplier, please also continue looking at your obligations of means, in particular purchasing practices. So your own contributions into these problems to also remain compliant with the German Supply Chain Act.
I'll add to that, like I just mentioned, we have excellent colleagues who work on different topics. You can access a recording on a webinar we did last year on the EUDR on our website as well. And I believe the help desk has also done some webinars on the kind of overlap between environmental obligations and human rights obligations, also under the Supply Chain Act. So feel free to take a look at that. We'll be sure to share the links in the slides. Another question we have here is, again, referring to EU regulation, saying that there is an overlap between CSRD and CSDD. Could we use the required CSRD report to satisfy the requirements of the competent authorities like the BAFA? Because the CSRD legislation, of course, states that if you publish a CSRD report, you don't need to report under CSDD.
Exactly. So there is actually not really an overlap because the CSDD only provides for public communication obligations for companies that are not in scope of the CSRD. And this is exactly the situation that we don't have with the German Supply Chain Act. So the German Supply Chain Act, I've mentioned this earlier, coming from a context where we didn't have the CSRD yet, we only had the NFRD. And the legislative process around the CSRD had started already, but its fate remained a bit unclear at the time. And so we have an own reporting obligation in the German Supply Chain Act, but the plan is to streamline this to get with the CSRD obligation, and the goal is that the CSRD will be the only reporting obligation in relation to sustainability in the European Union. So this is also among the many criticisms, bureaucratic burdens that's being mentioned a lot in discussions around the omnibus. And what I'm hearing a lot is the false statement that there's duplications of reporting obligations also on the EU platform, and they don't exist actually.
I'll add to that our reporting colleagues developed a really, really great tool last year that they've invested blood, sweat, and tears into. It's called the COP mapping. Most of you who are members will be familiar with the reporting obligation you have within the UN Global Compact, where you have to submit a yearly communication on progress. And the tool we've published, which is freely accessible on our website, allows you to compare not only our reporting standards with the CSRD, or rather more the ESRS, both the voluntary and the mandatory elements, but also the LkSG, meaning that you can use the tool to also draw comparison between the current reporting obligations under the LkSG and the ESRS if you're interested in doing that, but also with the GRI and the CDP if you're reporting more widely. We have another questions that kind of go in the direction of harmonization of EU regulation. I'll try and merge two. So one is kind of asking whether the LkSG is likely to change because of the CSDD, and then another question whether we can expect harmonization of all of these regulations. So LkSG, EUDR, CSDD, and all of the other abbreviations we could possibly think of.
Yeah, some very good questions. So the gem supply, so the CSDD is a directive, and as a directive, in order to take effect, it needs to be transposed into the domestic law of the European member states. And in Germany, this will be done by amending the German Supply Chain Act. Because of our snap election recently, this wasn't possible during the last administration, but the plan was actually to do it before the new election that then happened a little bit earlier. So there will be changes made to the German Supply Chain Act, and any changes to the CSDD in the context of the omnibus will then obviously also need to, will create an effect on the German Supply Chain Act that needs to be amended. And the harmonization of all other laws. There is already a great degree of harmonization. So in particular, in relation to reporting, all of these legislative acts either refer to the CSRD, apart from the German Supply Chain Act. This one is the odd one out, but all of the other European ones either refer to the CSRD by saying like reporting only happens under the CSRD. This act doesn't create its own obligations, or like the EUDR, for example, leaves it open for companies. They have to report on the EUDR, but they can choose to report by using the CSRD report. The FSME actually is a reporting standard, voluntary reporting standard for small and medium-sized enterprises. So this is one of the voluntary reporting standards as part of the ESRS that has to be used for the reporting under the CSRD. And while it might seem tempting, I don't think it makes sense to put everything into one big super law. I mean, there's others you could mention apart from the EUDR. There's the forced labor regulation, there's the battery regulation, there's the conflict minerals regulation, but they have very specialized rules in relation to the due diligence, because they are dealing with very special resources, very special problems, and obviously then must have very special measures that address them. And they are not conflicting with the CSDD, because I mentioned the rule that the more special rule has priority over the general rule. So when we have the rules of the conflict minerals regulation, I have to take measures based on the conflict minerals regulation. In relation to the same topic, I don't have to additionally create measures under the CSDD, because it does not apply on this particular context, in this particular context.
Okay, we only have two left. We're doing really great time-wise. We were a bit worried about it initially, but I think this is going great. We have a really specific question again on BAFA reporting and compliance. I'll try and interpret this because the phrasing isn't really clear to me, but I think they're asking that if we share our report with the BAFA only in December, so at the end of year and not until April, am I in compliant?
Yeah, so this is there's been lots of confusion around this. I feel like for years I've been asked many questions in relation to these deadlines because they have been changed. And generally, there's an annual reporting obligation, and the deadline is 4 months after the end of the business year in relation to which the company is reporting. But then there's been the deadline for the first reports has been moved a couple of times to give companies more leeway to adapt to these new rules. And then it was moved a couple more times, or one more time, I believe, actually, to allow for these changes to be made because of the CSDDD. So the German transposition law of the CSDDD would have allowed companies to choose between what I've mentioned earlier, submitting the BAFA questionnaire or using a CSRD report to comply with the German Supply Chain Act. But because of the snap election, this law hasn't been passed yet. But I believe it will happen sometime soon, hopefully. Maybe now not as soon as we thought because of the omnibus. Maybe it will be delayed a little bit. But as of now, the current deadline for the first report is the 31st of December of this year. So you're fine if you submit your report until then, and hopefully we'll have more information what's going to happen with the CSRD report versus the BAFA questionnaire.
In general, we'd recommend taking a look at the website of the BAFA. They've been really faithful in updating the FAQs. You can find a lot of information on there, and any information on when you're due to report should be available on that website as well. And then the last question we have is actually more of a comment than a question, but it might be really interesting to go a bit deeper and maybe take a look at that. And it's asking about the rather broad concept of employees under the CSDDD. Which the commentator mentioned that it makes a lot of sense for the main supply chain where you're producing sold goods, but they feel that it's actually not that helpful to make sense of base goods, which you need for the production, which aren't involved in the main production. Does that make sense? I feel like I've repeated a lot of words.
Yeah, no, it took me a while to understand this question, actually. And so, yeah, the question is what's the supply chain, basically? So am I buying because I make, I don't know, engines, and I'm buying different parts to build these engines, but I also have a canteen where my employees eat, and there's a cafeteria where they get coffee, and I also buy paper to print invoices and so on. I also have cleaning staff. And the question is like, what's part of the supply chain, what not? And you can really go into a long, deep rabbit hole and look at all the tiny details. I've once spoken to a company and said, what about the rubber that's in the tires of the cars that we have for some of our employees with which they're driving around, which they need to do to do our job as a service provider? So you could really say, okay, we're starting to look into where the rubber is coming from, and there's lots of problems in relation to the rubber, and all the companies that are buying coffee for their cafeterias could be looking into all the problems around coffee. But I feel you're really losing your focus if you're doing it like that. And the definition of the supply chain and the German supply chain means that it ranges from the production of the raw materials over using them in the production process, or sourcing of the raw materials, producing the things, shipping them until they're sold, or until the service that you do is brought to the final customers. And it involves everything that is necessary to produce your goods or to provide your service. And then the question is, what is necessary? So I would say maybe the coffee for the cafeteria, I would say maybe not necessary, even though everybody loves coffee, or most people do. But for example, the cleaning services, they are necessary. So necessary, I would understand, is everything that if you remove it from the equation, really changes your good or your service, or makes it very difficult to provide it. Yes.
I think that answers the question. We got one last one that kind of came in late, which is asking whether the LkSG and CSRD and the other regulations are aligned with the values of the UN Global Compact, or if they go beyond our expectations. So as the UN Global Compact, we don't operate on the basis of the national legislation, even though, of course, we have a lot of time spent working on the LkSG. Our basis is always the UN Guiding Principles and our own 10 principles, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. The helpful fact is that oftentimes these regulations are based on the international standard, which is the UN Guiding Principles. So you will find a lot of similarities between these regulations, and a lot of them build on something that we are working with anyway. So we always recommend using the UN Guiding Principles as your baseline, because they will help you be compliant and advance your human rights due diligence in many ways that covers a range of different regulations. In general, we as a UN Global Compact support a smart mix, meaning a smart mix between voluntary and obligatory requirements. So we do find it important that there's a level playing field for all of the countries and all of the companies to operate in. You can find our most recent statement on the CSDD and the Omnibus on our website, where we have a few more details. Sadly, that is all of the time we have today. We've left our contact details in the slides, which you will receive afterwards. I once again want to thank all of you who are answering the feedback questionnaire once you're leaving this webinar, because it really helps further improve what we're trying to do here and also gives us some hints on what we should cover next. Special thanks to you, Michaela, for doing this with us. This emerged as a really spontaneous idea last year. Really, really happy that we got to do it. We'll be able to access the reporting on both of our websites. And I think I'll speak on behalf of both of us that we're really glad that you joined us and hope to see all of you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.